Something has shifted, but not in the way you would notice immediately. There was no dramatic ending, no clear moment where everything changed, no final conversation that tied loose threads together. And yet, beneath the surface of what looked like normal life, something quietly began to break its old pattern. The emotional space that once felt occupied, familiar and certain started to feel distant, almost unfamiliar. At first it was easy to ignore, easy to explain away, easy to tell yourself it meant nothing. But silence has a way of revealing what noise used to hide, and in that silence, something unexpected begins to surface. Not confusion anymore, not denial, but awareness. Because what they walked away from didn't disappear. It simply stopped being blurred by proximity. And now, with distance doing what time always does, the truth begins to take shape in a way that can no longer be dismissed. And when that clarity begins to settle in, something subtle but powerful starts to happen. You stop arguing with your own perception. You stop trying to force the story to match the version of it you were hoping for at the time. Because a part of you eventually recognizes that confusion was never a sign that you were wrong. It was a sign that you were operating without complete information. And you were still trying to create emotional stability in a situation that was already becoming unstable on the other side. That realization alone begins to change the way you carry the memory. Not by erasing it, not by pushing it away, but by removing the pressure you placed on yourself to figure it out sooner or handle it differently. You start to see that you weren't lacking awareness. You were responding in real time to something that was unfolding gradually, without clarity, without direct communication, and without emotional alignment being openly maintained. And that kind of experience leaves a specific residue in the mind. Not just attachment, but unresolved questioning. The mind doesn't like unfinished patterns. It keeps revisiting them, not because it enjoys the pain, but because it's trying to complete a loop that was never properly closed. That's why certain memories don't just disappear with time. They resurface in quieter moments, in pauses, in emotional stillness, not to disturb you, but because they were never given a clean endpoint. But here is where something important begins to shift. At some point, you start to notice that revisiting the same emotional scenario doesn't produce new answers anymore. It only replays old interpretations, old assumptions, old emotional states that no longer match who you are becoming. And slowly, without forcing it, your attention starts to move elsewhere. Not because you've suppressed anything, but because your system begins to recognize that there is nothing left to extract from that cycle that would meaningfully change your present. This is where detachment becomes less about distance from a person and more about distance from a pattern of internal repetition. You begin to understand that closure was never something the other person had to give you in the exact way you imagined. Closure is what happens when your awareness outgrows the need for constant reinterpretation, when your mind no longer needs every unanswered moment to be solved in order to move forward. And that doesn't mean it stops meaning something, it means it stops controlling something. There's a difference between remembering and reliving. One keeps the past in its place. The other pulls you back into it without warning. And what changes over time is your ability to notice the difference the moment it begins. You start catching yourself earlier, noticing when your mind is trying to re-enter a familiar emotional loop, recognizing when you are no longer learning, just replaying. And in that recognition, you gain something that feels quiet but significant: choice. The choice not to engage the same thought in the same way. The choice not to reopen the same emotional door just because it is familiar. The choice to let the memory exist without stepping back into it. And with that choice, something internal starts to stabilize. Not instantly, not dramatically, but consistently over time. The emotional charge around the memory begins to weaken, not because the memory changes, but because your relationship to it does. What once felt heavy starts to feel distant. What once felt unclear starts to feel simple in its structure, even if it still carries emotion. And eventually, you reach a point where you can look back and understand something very clearly, without needing it to affect your present state, that it happened, that it impacted you, that it shaped how you see certain things, but it no longer defines the emotional space you live in. And that is the quiet shift most people don't notice when it happens. Not the moment of moving on as a dramatic event, but the moment where the past stops following you into the present, and in that space, your attention slowly returns to yourself, not as a reaction to what happened, but as a reconnection to what is still unfolding in your life right now. Without urgency, without emotional residue pulling you backward, just awareness, finally staying where it belongs. When they stepped into a connection with someone else, it wasn't because you were ever truly replaced. That's the easiest explanation for the mind to accept, but it's not the full emotional truth of what happened. In reality, it was an attempt to escape what they couldn't fully face within themselves, a way to quiet feelings that felt too deep, too real, too demanding of emotional honesty. But here's the truth that is slowly becoming unavoidable for them now. You were never replaced. You were deferred, pushed into the background of a decision they weren't emotionally ready to handle. And what they are beginning to realize is that this delay did not remove what existed between you. It only stretched it, distorted it, and left it unresolved. Part 2. Why they chose someone else. This may not be easy to process, but it is important for your clarity and emotional release. They didn't choose someone else out of a deeper love. They chose it out of emotional avoidance, out of fear, fear of depth, fear of intensity, fear of being emotionally exposed in a way they couldn't control or fully understand. What they experienced with you was not light or casual. It had weight. It had emotional truth behind it. And instead of staying present with that truth, instead of developing the courage it required, they leaned towards something that felt simpler on the surface, something that demanded less emotional accountability, something that didn't confront them with the same level of inner vulnerability. But what feels easy in the beginning often becomes revealing over time. And even while they were in that new dynamic, something in them never fully detached from you. Mentally, emotionally, even subconsciously, they compared. Not openly, not intentionally, but constantly. Different moments, different reactions, different conversations, all measured against what they once had with you. And without realizing it, every comparison brought them back to the same realization. What you had cannot be recreated by convenience or replaced by comfort, because what existed with you wasn't built on ease, it was built on emotional depth, and depth is not something that can simply be substituted. Part 3. The guilt they carry in silence. What you don't see is that their internal world is not as settled as it may appear from the outside. There are moments, especially in stillness, especially at night, when everything becomes louder for them internally. That is when guilt begins to surface. Not in dramatic ways, not in visible breakdowns, but in quiet reflections they don't share with anyone. Guilt for leaving without providing real clarity. Guilt for choosing emotional comfort over honest communication. Guilt for hurting someone who gave authenticity instead of confusion. They revisit fragments of conversations. They remember your words differently now, not as something to dismiss, but as something they finally understand with distance. And with that understanding comes regret. This guilt doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It stays beneath the surface, hidden behind daily distractions, routines, and forced normalcy, but it doesn't disappear. Because avoidance never dissolves emotional truth. It only delays its impact. And what they avoided feeling in the moment has not gone away. It has simply matured inside them over time. Part 4. Why they couldn't speak before. It's natural to wonder why they stayed silent when clarity could have changed everything. But their silence wasn't a lack of care, it was a lack of inner readiness. They were afraid that if they started speaking honestly, everything they had been suppressing would come out at once. Emotions, confusion, attachment, fear, everything they had been holding back. They were also afraid of commitment to their own truth, because once something is spoken out loud, it becomes real. It creates responsibility. It creates consequences. And they were not prepared for that level of emotional accountability. There was also something about you they quietly recognized. Your ability to perceive truth without needing it heavily explained. They knew that if honesty entered the space between you, it would not remain half-lived or half-said. It would demand completion. It would demand clarity. And they weren't ready for what that level of honesty would require from them. So instead of facing it, they chose silence. But silence always carries its own outcome. It doesn't end situations. It only reshapes them into something unresolved. Something has shifted inside them, even if it didn't happen in a loud or obvious way. On the surface, life may have continued normally. They may still be functioning, still showing up, still engaging in the same routines, conversations, and distractions they always have. But internally, something subtle has changed position. A quiet imbalance, a growing sense of emotional distance from themselves that they can't fully explain or justify away anymore. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic realization. It builds slowly, through moments of stillness they didn't plan for. Late at night, during pauses in conversation, in the gaps between distractions where there is nothing left to scroll through or run toward. And in those gaps, a feeling begins to surface. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent. A sense of emptiness they can no longer fully negotiate with. Not emptiness in the dramatic sense, but emotional misalignment. A feeling of not being fully seen, not fully understood, not fully grounded in what they chose. A quiet internal question begins repeating itself without words. Was that really it? Was that really the direction I was meant to take? And in that inner silence, something unexpected begins to resurface. Not as confusion, not as nostalgia, but as recognition. The realization that what existed between you was not something fragile or accidental, not something that simply didn't work out in the way they may have tried to frame it to themselves or others. It begins to return in a clearer emotional form, the understanding that what they stepped away from had weight, had depth, had presence, and most importantly, it had truth. What they once felt with you starts returning in a different way now, because distance has a strange effect. It removes noise. It strips away justification. It takes away the emotional momentum that once made avoidance feel like clarity. And what remains is what was always there underneath. Connection. Real connection doesn't disappear just because it is avoided. It doesn't vanish because someone convinces themselves it should. It doesn't dissolve simply because it is inconvenient. It lingers in the background of awareness until it is fully understood or fully accepted. And that is what begins to surface now. Part 6. The message they wish they could say. If they could speak, without fear, without defensiveness, without the instinct to protect their own emotional image, their words would not be complicated. They would be painfully simple. I thought leaving would bring me clarity. I thought choosing distance would make everything lighter, easier, more manageable for me emotionally. I told myself I was doing the right thing by stepping away, by creating space, by trying to move forward in a different direction. But the truth is, it didn't feel like forward movement. It felt like disconnection from something I didn't fully understand the value of while I had access to it. And now that I've had time, I see things differently. I see the moments I misunderstood. I see the ways I didn't show up. I see the silence I left behind and the questions I never answered. And I need you to understand something I couldn't express at the time. I never left because you weren't enough. I left because I didn't know how to hold something that made me feel that deeply without losing control of myself in the process. These words may never be spoken, not because they don't exist, but because expressing them requires a level of vulnerability that many people only reach internally first, if they reach it at all. But inside, something like this begins to form anyway. A recognition that becomes harder to suppress the longer distance continues. Because time does not erase understanding, it often sharpens it. Part 7. Why this is surfacing now. This awareness is not random. It is not happening in isolation. It is directly connected to change. Your change, because you are no longer in the same emotional position you were before. You are not standing in the same place of uncertainty. You are not waiting in the same emotional tension. You are not measuring your worth through someone else's inconsistency anymore. Something in you has shifted out of reaction and into observation. out of emotional dependence and into awareness. And that shift is not invisible. Even without contact, even without conversation, even without explanation, dynamic change is felt because emotional systems between two people don't require words to update. They adjust through behavior, through distance, through energy, through presence, or the lack of it. And what they are sensing now is no longer the version of you that was available in the same way. No longer the version that tolerated uncertainty without question. No longer the version that filled silence with patience. That version is no longer leading, and that absence creates awareness. They begin to notice that access to you is no longer assumed. That emotional availability is no longer automatic. That the space they once occupied in your attention is no longer guaranteed. And that realization changes how memory behaves. Because memory without access becomes reflection. Part 8. The unexpected realization. What is happening inside them is not just regret in the simple sense of missing someone. It is deeper than that. It becomes self-examination. They start questioning not only the outcome, but the version of themselves that made the decisions leading to that outcome. And that is where discomfort begins to form. Because it is much easier to distance yourself from someone else than it is to sit with the reality of your own emotional avoidance, inconsistency, or fear. And when there is no longer distraction strong enough to override that reflection, it begins to surface more clearly. They remember moments differently now. Not just what happened, but how it happened. Not just what was said, but what was avoided. Not just the ending, but everything that led to it. And in that reflection, a difficult truth begins to form. It wasn't insignificant, it wasn't shallow, it wasn't easily replaceable. And that realization carries weight because it forces accountability, not necessarily to you, but to themselves. And self-accountability is often where emotional discomfort becomes unavoidable. Because losing someone who mattered does not only create longing, it creates contrast. It shows what presence felt like compared to absence. And that comparison is not always gentle. Part 9. What this truly means for you. This is not a message designed to pull you back into emotional waiting. It is not here to reopen what you have already begun to understand. And it is not here to make you look backward for answers that were never clearly given in the first place. It is here to clarify something that often takes time to fully see. You were not reduced because you lacked value. You were not dismissed because you were not enough. You were not forgotten because you were replaceable. You were encountered by someone who did not have the capacity at that time to fully understand, hold, or sustain the depth of what they were experiencing. And that difference matters because it shifts the entire narrative from something wrong with you to something unprocessed in them. And regardless of whether this story ever circles back or continues forward without reconnection, something fundamental has already changed. Your position within it. You are no longer standing in emotional suspension. You are no longer waiting for clarity from someone else to define your understanding. You are no longer measuring your worth through unanswered questions. You are beginning to carry clarity yourself. And that is where strength quietly forms, not in resistance. Not in emotional chasing, not in trying to decode silence, but in the simple act of no longer abandoning your own awareness for the sake of uncertainty. If this connection ever returns, it will not meet the same version of you that once waited without clarity. It will meet someone who understands themselves more clearly now. Someone who is no longer emotionally available in the same unguarded way. Someone who can recognize inconsistency without confusion. And if it does not return, you will not collapse into unanswered questions the way you once might have. Because your grounding is no longer external, it is internal. And that is the part that changes everything without needing to announce itself. You were never meant to spend your awareness chasing clarity from someone who could not consistently offer it. You were meant to arrive at the point where you no longer needed to. And once you reach that point, the story stops being about them returning and starts being about you no longer requiring their return to be whole. Conclusion. And in the end, what remains is not confusion, not longing, and not the need for answers that may never arrive in the way you once expected them to. What remains is clarity, because every experience that once felt unfinished begins to take on a different meaning when you are no longer standing inside it emotionally. From a distance, what used to feel chaotic starts to reveal its structure. What once felt personal rejection begins to reveal emotional limitation, and what once felt like loss slowly transforms into understanding. You begin to see that not every ending is a reflection of your worth. Some endings are simply the result of timing, capacity, emotional readiness, and internal alignment that was never equally shared between two people. And when that imbalance becomes clear, the weight you carried alone starts to dissolve, not because the experience didn't matter, but because you stop misinterpreting it. There is a quiet strength in no longer needing to rewrite your value based on someone else's inconsistency. A strength in no longer searching for closure in places that were never willing to offer it. And an even deeper strength in realizing that closure was never something another person was meant to give you in the first place. It was something you were always going to arrive at yourself. And you are arriving there now, not through force, not through denial, not through emotional suppression, but through awareness that has matured enough to hold truth without distortion. The truth that you were not too much. The truth that you were not replaceable in the way you may have once feared. And the truth that what was real between you did not lose its meaning simply because it was not sustained. It only lost its place in your life. And that difference matters more than it seems. Because something important happens when you stop interpreting absence as rejection and start seeing it as reflection. You stop chasing explanations that were never going to satisfy the depth of your questions. You stop reopening emotional doors just to see if clarity might finally be waiting on the other side. And slowly, your energy returns to you, not in a dramatic shift, but in a quiet reclaiming. You begin to notice that your thoughts are no longer centered around "why didn't they?" and start moving toward "what do I choose now?" That single shift changes everything, because it marks the moment where your emotional life is no longer orbiting around uncertainty but around intention, and from that place, the past no longer has authority over your direction. It becomes something you understand, not something you are trapped inside, something you learn from, not something you keep reliving, something that shaped you but no longer defines you. So if there is any final message in all of this, it is simple. You are not waiting for someone else to complete the story anymore. You are learning to live as the author of what comes next. And in that realization, the silence loses its power, the confusion loses its weight, and what once felt like loss quietly transforms into something else entirely, a beginning that no longer needs permission to continue.